O projeto Pensar e Fazer Arte do GEP, Grupo de Estudo e Pesquisa em Interdisciplinaridade, e FAFICLA, Faculdade de Filosofia, Comunicação, Letras e Artes, Departamento de Inglês, e GEP, Grupo de Estudo e Pesquisa em Interdisciplinaridade, coordenado por Ivani Fazenda, tem a honra de receber em nossos estúdios na TV PUC o professor David Heathfield. David Heathfield é um storyteller, um contador de história, e está aqui no nosso programa para nos dar uma entrevista baseada na sua performance aqui junto à cultura inglesa e junto aos alunos da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo. David, the English Department of the Catholic University of São Paulo, the project Living Drama coordinated by Vera Cabrera, the Associação Cultura Inglesa for having sponsored your coming to Brazil, the project To Think and Make Art, coordinated by me, and GEPI, Group of Studies and Research on Interdisciplinarity, coordinated by Professor Ivani Fazenda, would like to thank you very, very much for making this videotaping, the videotaping of this program, possible. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here to talk about storytelling and teaching.
Well, the pleasure is mine as well. I'm really delighted to have been invited by PUC and the Cultura Inglesa. It's an absolute honour to be here. So I've been made to feel incredibly welcome.
It has been a pleasure to have received you here.
Thank you.
This morning, that was very, everything went very, very fine.
I couldn't have hoped for anything better.
Oh, thank you, thank you. David, can you tell us something about your childhood and adolescence?
Well, I grew up in a very secure family environment. I grew up with my mother, father, 3 sisters, 2 older, 1 younger, in a small seaside town called Exmouth. And strangely, funnily, I still live very close to where I grew up as a child. I live in the nearest city, Exeter, and I can pop down and see my aging mother as often as I like and often as I can. And it was a place where we spent a lot of time outside at the beach, swimming in the sea, even when the sea was cold. You know, the English Sea is not like the sea here. It's the same sea, it's the Atlantic, but a very different part of the Atlantic.
But the temperature
is different. So I'm used to the refreshing cold water, and I've always loved water. I'm a water baby, I suppose. But I was also what you might call a sickly child. I spent a lot of time at home, a lot of time with my mother, because I had quite chronic asthma. And that has an influence because I was always in stories at home. My mother, she'd be cooking or in the kitchen. I would always be at the table, always with a book, telling stories. But even before I started school, I was creating stories, drawing pictures, the first story, my mother still has a copy, is The Tiger Who Liked Crisps. So yeah, and my father, getting home from work, he was an accountant, he would get home from work, come upstairs, and me and my younger sister would be already in bed, and he would sit on the end of the bed, tell us a story, make up a story.
How sweet.
Make up stories, tell us stories, sing songs. So I think stories were there from the beginning for me.
Yes, in interdisciplinarity you have to look for the beginning of things, you see? And do you think that that is the point where the whole thing about storytelling started?
You know, we're always inventing our own narrative, and maybe that's the story I've created. But I've told it so many times, I think I believe it.
Okay, let me ask you the second question. When did storytelling become part of your life?
Storytelling. I was involved in community theatre for a number of years, and then I was also teaching English. And as part of my theatre experience, we did quite a lot of interaction with the audience. It wasn't a kind of behind, a fourth wall style theatre. It was very interactive kind of theatre, meeting the local people. sometimes street theatre style as well.
Oh, wonderful.
And that experience gave me confidence about interacting with an audience. And I was bringing ideas from drama into my English teaching and realizing its potential, realizing students were benefiting and enjoying and commenting on that. So then I started to develop it. Crucial moment happened in 2003. 2003, I had been working as an academic manager of a small language school, but the school was in financial crisis. The school closed temporarily, and I was made redundant. I was in a crisis. And you know what they say, every cloud has a silver lining. I had to, what am I going to do? I have a family. How am I going to support my family? So I got some work teaching at the University of Exeter, where I still am now, but they couldn't give me a full-time contract, you know, not just like that. So I thought, what can I do? What are my skill set? I can tell stories. My students like my stories. So I started to promote myself independently, freelance, as a storyteller who would go into local primary and secondary schools and do workshops. And they liked it. So a couple of years later...
Thank God they did.
Thank God they did. A couple of years later, the university said, oh, David, now we have a full-time post for you. No, thank you. I am now established as a freelance storyteller, teacher, trainer. My book had already been published by that stage, Spontaneous Speaking. I'm ready now to keep my freelance status, but I want to combine that. I want to continue the classroom experience of teaching, because as a storyteller, most of my encounters are very short-lived. I spend a day or a half a day in one place. That can't match the experience of teaching the same group ongoing for a term or a year, where you develop a relationship.
Quite different.
So I have the best of both worlds.
Very good.
I'm
very
lucky.
Good.
I'm very lucky.
Connelly and Clendenin, in the book Storytelling and Narratives, they define a teacher as a storyteller. Although I could not agree more with their definition or their concept about teaching, I would like to know your opinion about it.
I wholeheartedly agree. However, in my experience, most teachers neglect the storytelling that's natural to them.
Because everything that is good is neglected.
Everything that's good is neglected. They haven't been told that storytelling is a good idea. In English language teaching, people have this idea that whenever the teacher is talking, the students aren't talking. Therefore, teacher talk is considered to be maybe a negative thing.
Yes,
but,
teacher talking time.
Yeah, but in fact, we need to look at the quality of the teacher talking and what's happening in teacher talking. Of course, meta-language is necessary, but that, you know, we can keep that to a minimum. We can use good content language, and storytelling is perfect for that. Storytelling is how we learned. It's how we learned before we had classrooms for tens of thousands of years.
That's perfect. That's perfect. And in terms of methodology, what do you do after you tell a story to an audience, as you did this morning?
Well, it depends. It really depends on what I've arranged with the people who have invited me to do storytelling. So it might be a performance where the audience are allowed to absorb, reflect on the story. But mostly I like to run workshops where there's an opportunity to do interaction after the story, where people can reflect in a kind of guided way. There's a lot of freedom to imagine, but there's a framework that's provided where people might explore what they've imagined during the story, look at mental imagery, or I might invite people to do some drama immediately based on the story, some role play, or perhaps a discussion of the...
Or to invent a different end to the story.
Invent a different end to the story, discuss ethical matters, and often to look for personal experiences that the story has reminded them of. So the story is a trigger for talking about personal story.
Good. A trigger for...
Personal story.
For personal story. Yes, people generally neglect personal stories. And they cannot possibly consider that we are composed, we are formed by our our private stories and academic stories.
As you know, amazing.
And you cannot separate them.
We cannot separate them. And amazing but not surprising, research, as you're, I'm sure, aware of by neuroscientists, is showing just how we make sense of the world by filtering information and making it into our narrative. That's what I was saying earlier about how did it all begin. That's the story I tell. Yes. And I believe that story, but I'm filtering out a lot of other things.
David, can you point out some advantages of using storytelling for teaching?
For teaching generally, or generally? Oh, right. Storytelling is co-creative. So storytelling is not about one person performing and everybody listening. It's an activity in which the listeners are participating alongside. They're telling the story internally, they're anticipating, they're predicting. And again, going back to from the book I've just written, Storytelling with Our Students, I did a small amount of research on neuroscience, and again, experiments showing that when people are listening to a narrative, the brain pattern is showing that they're actually not just going at the same speed as, the concepts that the storyteller is thinking of, those patterns are mirrored in what's happening in the listener's mind, but even sometimes they're jumping ahead of the storyteller because they're anticipating. They're often thinking things before the storyteller thinks them, which is amazing to look at that. But kind of when you think about it, quite natural. So it really is a truly co-creative experience. So I think it's that shared knowledge that we are primed for as human beings.
Wonderful answer. Very good.
I'm glad you like it.
I really did. I really did. And how does the audience react and interact when you tell them a story that, like The Small Bird's Wisdom?
Some stories, students interact externally. They may gasp, or they may exclaim, or I might even invite them to join in and participate verbally in the storytelling. Others, I might ask them to imagine what happens at the end of the story. Others, the experience is happening internally, so it really varies from story to story. In the case of The Small Bird's Wisdom, when I tell that story, I usually get students to imagine what they think could happen before I tell the story. Let me explain.
Just by suggesting something?
What I do with The Small Bird's Wisdom, a typical activity I do with that story, is I will say, I'm going to tell you a story about a rich man who finds a bird, and the bird wants freedom. That's all. Ask me questions. Find out as much as you can about the story. So the students quiz me about the story, and I only answer their questions for a couple of minutes. And then I say, okay, you have a certain amount of information. Now you tell the story that you think I'm going to tell. So they tell the story, and their creativity astounds me. And then I say, okay, now do you want to hear the traditional Polish story, The Small Bird's Wisdom? And I tell them, and they are comparing the story, the traditional story, with the story that they've imagined. And it's fascinating, fascinating. And then afterwards, actually discussing those comparisons and what the story means to them. It's a beautiful story.
Actually, these comparisons can create a different story.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's that marriage, yes.
Very, very fascinating. Very good, very good. Do you have and use stories of your own, written and interpreted by you, or do you also take advantage of stories people from different parts of the world tell you? Example, how do you go about collecting them? How do you collect stories? What are the cultural ingredients you look for?
There isn't one way in which I collect stories. When I started, most commonly I got stories from written sources, anthologies, a lot I found on the internet, because often I was asked, David, do you know any stories from Southern Africa? And then I didn't have a big repertoire at the beginning, so I would go and search On the internet, fantastic. There are so many resources in English, stories from around the world. As time's gone on, I have had increasing opportunity, especially as I'm invited to travel, to meet people from many different cultures, teachers and students, and I always ask them for stories. And in my book that's just coming out, half of the stories in that book, there's about 40 stories, about 20 of those stories are stories I've learned directly from people from cultures other than my own. Sometimes in the UK, sometimes in other parts of the world.
Do you adapt them or do you tell them
both?
As they are?
I strive to tell the story in a traditional way. In other words, keeping the essence of the story.
As you receive it.
However, what actually happens is that the story becomes mine over a series of tellings. When I first tell the story, I'm very conscious of the storyteller who gave it to me. I hear his voice or her voice, and I'm even sometimes finding myself physically being in their mode of being. I'm an observer, so I even find myself having some of the same physical behaviors as the person who gave it to me. Having said that, it does begin to change with the second, third, fourth telling, and then it becomes like the story's coming from my imagination, but I never forget the person who gave me the story.
You never forget the source.
I never forget the source. A good example, there's a story called Manju, which is a Japanese story, and it was told to me by one of the most extrovert Japanese young women that I've ever taught. I've taught many people from Japan. She came to study at the university in the UK, and she was the live wire. She was so full of life. Everybody loved her. She played the trombone.
Oh.
And she told this story to the whole class, and it blew me away. And you know, that's the way she told that story, because her English was, she wasn't fluent, but she was expressing her culture and her love of story.
With body expression and everything.
I could never forget the way she told that story. So Satomi Endo is always behind me when I tell that story.
Wonderful. I know what you mean.
Yes.
I know what you mean. Yes. As we have many, many teachers telling us what to say, they are all surrounding us.
Yes.
Paulo Freire, when he was in Antonietta Celani, Wilkins, they are all here. They are all here.
We all have our personal, for me, the people who influence me most are often people I've actually encountered, worked with, learned directly from. For me, I've got Mario Rinvolucri, Andrew Wright. They're really close to me. They're good friends, and they're gurus. Gurus, really.
Yes. Here, inside the academy, I have 5 mothers. 5 mothers. Only mothers, excluding the fathers, only mothers.
That's interesting. For me, my role models are male. Even though I've got 3 sisters.
I have mothers and fathers.
Yes,
I have 5 mothers, because my two tutors were women. Consequently, I have 2. Then I have Virgin Mary, the first one. I have my mother, who gave birth to me.
Right.
I have Ivani Fazenda, Antonietta Celani, right? And my 5th mother, who is my metaphor in my doctorate thesis, is Maria Callas.
Looking at it that way, I also have many mothers. I was thinking about it purely from the storytelling academic perspective, but yeah, on a more global sense, yes, of course.
It's a global sense.
Oh yeah, no,
it's a global sense.
I have to say, because I'm in a profession that is dominated by women, it can't be denied, and certainly where I teach in the UK, in terms of just the numbers of teachers that are female, and the fact that I grew up with 3 sisters, it's actually remarkable how I have to say, I think that I've learned a lot about empathy and listening from women that have surrounded me in my life. I think that has a profound effect.
Yes. A different way of looking at things.
Yeah.
Generally. That makes us feel a bit tormented, but sometimes they teach us a great deal.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Although teaching is considered by many an art, for the art of teaching is the art of assisting discovery, For you to be able to tell a story, acting is an essential tool. Did you take any course on acting classes?
Short answer, no, I didn't. I learned acting by doing it. I didn't develop my strong interest in drama until I had been working for several years after my studies. And I learned from doing, and then I began to read. And I read independently. I didn't actually do an academic course in drama. So, yeah, that's the honest answer.
In terms of culture, we have 1 minute to finish this part of the program, and then I would like to tell our audience that there will be the second program being recorded after this. In terms of culture, whose concept is very complex. What has changed inside you with so many different stories from many different places, involving many nationalities? What are the changes, the psychological changes inside David Heathfield?
Storytelling makes it possible for me to really respect other people and where they've come from and who they are and what's behind them. I feel hugely privileged to do the job that I do. What used to happen, let me be frank, what used to happen before I got into storytelling is I would make a lot more judgments, prejudice. I had a lot more prejudice about people from different cultures, ignorance. By listening to people's stories, I've realized two things: that there's a universality, that the themes in stories tend to be universal, even though there are significant cultural differences. They're about morality, they're about good and evil largely. There are characters, however, that appear more in some cultures than others. Across Asia, for example, there are many trickster stories, true in Africa as well. And while tricksters are an important part of European storytelling, there are many other kinds of character that maybe prevail. So it's those little cultural differences as well that fascinate me, that make me think, oh, that tells me, that opens a window into another person's view of the world. So it's both the universality and the specific cultural differences fascinate me. So I'm on a constant learning path.
Wonderful, because we never finish learning. Never.
How could we?
We cannot. And that is the most tragic, let's say, facet of our job, but at the same time, it's the most fascinating. Yeah. Of course. In the Brazilian interdisciplinarity, we take into consideration 3 kinds of knowledge. The epistemological knowledge, to know how to know, that's the theories, the methods, the approaches, etc. We have to know. The practical knowledge, to know how to do or to make using this theoretical background we acquire, right? And the ontological knowledge, to know how to be a teacher. These 3 parts cannot possibly be separated. How has the use of storytelling been affecting the human being David Heathfield?
Well, I would say that the doing of storytelling came first. Now, recently, because I've been writing about storytelling and I've had to do quite a lot of research and background reading, you begin to unpick and realize what's behind, what's going on. But in my case, and I think it's true for many people who work in telling traditional stories, a lot of it is unconscious, what we actually do. And it's only when we do that analysis that these things become revealed. But But what do I want to say here? I mean, I know storytellers within the world that there's a storytelling, I'm not going to say fraternity, but there's a storytelling society. Brotherhood, because there's a lot of women, so I want to be careful with the terms I use. I'm a member of, I'll go back a bit. I'm a member of the Society for Storytelling in the UK. And some people would say that the Society for Storytelling is very closed in the sense that we're very obsessed with the traditional story, the ancient story, the stories that have been passed down. And obviously storytelling goes way beyond that. There's lots of modern ways of telling story through video and YouTube and all sorts of things. But a lot of the storytellers that I know and work with and admire are telling stories in a very natural way, and are sometimes all the better for doing that. Because sometimes when we overanalyze, I think we can become over-conscious of every little detail and what we're actually doing. Having said that, as a teacher, it certainly benefits me to know why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's a difficult question. That's a difficult question.
It's a difficult question.
Suddenly my
but I think it was very well answered.
But suddenly my fluency disappeared.
It was very well answered.
Really?
Thank you very, very much. And I'd like to, eu gostaria de agradecer os telespectadores pela audiência de mais Pensar e Fazer Arte. Muito obrigado.